All right. I think we can get started. So, hello everyone. Welcome to yet another webinar from Opsource. For today's webinar, our topic is going to be effective front-end monitoring. And to run today's webinar, we have Naveen Pai here, who's a founding engineer with Opsverse. And a couple of quick notes before we get started. The webinar is being recorded, so we will send out the recording after the webinar. You can make use of the Q&A option if you have any questions to submit, and I can actually read that out to Naveen, and we'll try to answer that as soon as possible in the webinar. And at the end of the webinar, we do have some dedicated time for Q&A as well. All right, Naveen, over to you.
Thank you so much, Arul. Hi, everyone. Let me just one of these out. Hey, everyone. I'm Naveen. Like Arul introduced, I'm a founding engineer at OpsVerse. I'm going to be a host today for this nice and short webinar that we have planned out, where we'll be talking about front-end monitoring 101. So let's get straight to it. First, a quick introduction about myself, right? Like why me to do this talk? So usually, I've spent most of my career working as a full stack engineer. So I've actually worked on backend systems, front-end systems, and usually in B2B companies where, SLAs and SLIs actually mean finance, right? It can actually get sued for not meeting an SLA or an SLO. And I keep telling Arul and I keep telling my team that like after coming into OpsVerse is the first time when I worked on the ops side of things, right? So I'm more or less repenting for all these years that I used to curse my ops team for not being fast enough. And now I'm on the other side where I'm complaining about my dev team for not being stable enough, right? Or not following the best practices, so to speak. So that's why like this talk kind of comes in from a bunch of the learnings that we had over the last few years when we like looked at these problems emerge repeatedly across companies when we're talking about front-end monitoring. And we look at some of these tools and techniques around it. So for folks who are new to OpsVerse, so OpsVerse is a fully managed DevOps tool stack. So we actually provide multiple tools that are there. So our flagship product right now is something called Observe Now, which is a turnkey managed opinionated observability stack that's built on top of battle-tested OSS tools. We're cross-geo, we're cross-cloud, and we support private SaaS as well, which means that the entire stack can actually be run within your own cloud, which means that even we don't have access to the data, right? Which is something that you don't really get with any proprietary companies. Another product that we have that we've been talking about quite a bit recently is the Opsource One, which is a customizable internal developer portal. And that behind the scenes is powered by Backstage, right? And the third offering that we have is we also do a bunch of managed products for you. So if you're looking for a managed Argo CD or for managed Postlog, and you're looking to get into either the CI/CD side of things with Argo or into product analytics with Postlog, then we actually offer managed versions of both of them as well. So as you can see, like as a company, we're very, very strong in terms of like wanting to work on top of open source. We honestly believe, as you can see across the table, all our products actually are built on top of open source, and that's been by design, right? We kind of believe that there's a gap between what an open source product is and what a business needs, and we kind of are trying to bridge that gap. So without much further ado, with that introduction in place, let's get into it. So over the next 30 minutes or so, I think this is going to be the agenda that we'll be following. We'll start off talking a little bit about like what's broken in front-end monitoring today, and we'll look at a little bit of what the workflows are that most people follow today. We'll talk a little bit about what front-end observability is all about, and we'll talk a little bit about like the differences between observability and monitoring as well. Then we'll talk about open telemetry and why we at OpsVerse are huge fans of it. And then getting to the main part, we'll talk about some tools and techniques for front-end observability. We'll do a quick demo, and yeah, a very small plug as well in there, and I'm warning everyone right at the start. And then yeah, we'll break out for Q&A. So with that said, let's break it down, right? Like for almost all of us who are on this call today, either we're on the front-end side of things or back-end side of things, or we're on the ops side of things. But by and large, every system kind of breaks down into these two simple boxes, right? You have a front end and you have a server that it talks to. Now, it's possible that your front end in JavaScript world, right? You can have, it's probably a React app, it's probably vanilla JavaScript, it's probably a WordPress site, it's probably something else that's running. It's probably server-side rendered. It doesn't really matter, right? And on the server side as well, you can have a whole bunch of tooling. It can be written in Python, Node, Go. It may be a monolith. You may have multiple microservices that are talking to each other. I know friends who like work at companies where like every API call goes through 30, 40 microservices to get you a response, things like that, right? But by and large, you can break it down into these two components, which is the front end and the server. So now, obviously, the question that comes up is, as you start building your product, how do you monitor these components, right? So let's start off with what's most commonly done, which is on the server side of things. So on the server side of things, you have a bunch of these tools. I'm sure all of us have used at least one of these, but I know that the ecosystem is so large that even with like 10 or 12 names in Studio, I'm probably missing about a dozen. So Splunk, your Sumo Logics, your Prometheus, your Nagios, your Graphite, CloudWatch, blah, 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 right? And all of these, depending on the marketing jargon, it'll either be sold to you as monitoring tools or as APM solutions or as something else, right? But behind the scenes, all that they're doing is you give it certain things to monitor, and it's monitoring things on the server side of things. Now that may be API uptime, that may be your heap usage if you're using a JVM, or maybe some other metric like that, right? And now let's look at the front end side of things. What do we do to monitor our front ends, right? And here, as you can see, the number of tools immediately starts coming down, and then the quality also is very different. So the tools most commonly that we've seen people using was probably something like Sentry, maybe Pingdom, which is more of an uptime monitor. You have Raygun, which has grown into a little bit more of a front-end stack. And funnily enough, Lighthouse, right, which is used by a lot of people. I've actually included it in front-end monitoring, even though it doesn't really monitor your front-end, but I think it does give us metrics that are useful from a front-end perspective to understand how our front-end is performing, which is why I've listed it here as well. Now, as you can see, there's between the previous slide and this slide, there's two problems that are there here. In terms of the quality of tools that you have and the quantity of tools that you have, most people and most companies tend to focus on securing their API endpoints and securing their servers and securing everything else and making sure that everything is heavily monitored on the server side. But the moment you move into the front end side of things, there's a huge quantitative and qualitative gap that comes in. And secondly, and this is something that's more important to me as a developer, is that the front-end tools don't really talk to anything on the back-end side of things. And that means that when you're using a front-end, if you identify a bug in the front-end side of things, then you have to pass context over to the back-end somehow. So this data for the front-end and back-end monitoring are stored in separate silos. And that makes it really, really hard for anyone to get a full stack view of the picture, right? And invariably, what ends up happening is something like this. And this is a story as old as time where we've seen with multiple customers where the server metrics are like a whole bunch of 200 OKs. They have 4 nines uptime. The P95 is very good. The P99 is very good. But the users then come in and say, hey, this app is broken, slow, or non-functional for me. And this gets even worse when you're in a big enough org where usually these issues that come from a user ends up going to someone from the support. Then support tries to verify the issue. Then that gets sent to a front-end person working on the front-end side of things. And from a front-end engineer who debugs it, if it is something to do with or he or she suspects it's something to do with the backend, then that gets thrown over to the backend side of things where again, there's no, like I mentioned, no context. So you have to figure out all over again what the issue is and reproduce it there. And this becomes even worse when these issues are not always reproducible, right? So if you say 9 users think the app is working fine for them, but there's a 10th user who keeps complaining about the app being broken or non-functional for him or her, then again, like our monitoring tools don't really answer those questions, right? So this is kind of where we get into the world of observability. And we'll talk about that in a little bit more detail here. So observability is a really nice term, and it's been borrowed into DevOps from control theory. And there's one definition of observability that I personally really like, which says that observability is a measure of how well internal states of a system can be inferred from knowledge of its external outputs. Now, what this basically means is that observability is there to help you answer the question, how did my system end up here? Now that here may be something you have seen before, it may be something you have never seen before, it may be something you have seen once in a while, but it's basically observability is all about getting you to that point where you're able to understand why your system is where it is, right? And that I think is one of the big differences between what we call monitoring and what we call observability. because when you're monitoring a system, you know what you're monitoring. But observability is all about answering the unknowns that are there, right? How did my system end up here? And that's why you have to have as much data as possible to answer this observability question. So now focusing on observability in the front-end side of things, if you think about observability for a front-end app, right, what exactly would it include? Unfortunately, like most people just look at the server side of observability and say that, oh, let me monitor everything on the server side. Let me have tracing on the server side. Let me have everything on the server side, and then ignore all the rest that goes with it, right? So some of the things that I personally believe are really important for front-end apps to actually be observable, to like actually answer questions about how the app is performing, are things like A, the web vitals, B is your application performance, C is your front-end logs, which all of us devs are like guilty of using way too much, right? Especially in the front-end side of things, we use logs for a lot more debugging than we do otherwise. Then of course, metrics, right? Other metrics. And a model that I personally really like is the Rail model of metrics. So Rail basically stands for response, animation, idle, and load. So you measure those 4 things, right? The response time, how quickly an animation frame can be created, how idle is the browser and your front-end app, because you want your browser to be as idle as possible so that it can always process things faster. And L is how long things take to load. And the 4th thing, which is like something that's again important, is tracing for app workflows. Now, what tracing basically means is that on the front end, right, it's never just you click a button and something happens. In today's modern front ends, especially when you have things that are like completely single page applications where there are multiple state changes that are happening between a click of a button and an action actually being performed, which can also have multiple API calls happening behind the scenes. It becomes very important for us to also be able to like time some of these things, right? Understand where exactly our app is taking time, what actions are taking time, and if we know an action is taking time, what within that action is actually taking time. So this is kind of what front-end observability is all about. And then the question obviously comes in is how do we fix this, right? How do we tackle this issue of having silos of information, silos between the front end and the back end, silos that don't really talk to each other? And the answer is quite obvious, but as with most questions, the answers are quite obvious only in retrospect, right? And the answer is obviously standardization. And thankfully for us, we have this great standard called OpenTelemetry that exists today that is standardizing a lot of these things around the observability space, right? So OpenTelemetry basically offers a standard way of collecting and displaying traces, metrics, and logs. It's an open source project again, and like I mentioned at the start, that's one more reason that we at Opsource are really big fans of open source. OpenTelemetry is currently CNCF incubating as well. It is vendor neutral, which again is very important, and we'll get to why in a bit. And as a developer, another reason why OpenTelemetry is great is because it's cross-language. Now, what this means is irrespective of whether your application is written in a backend language, right? Let's say Python or Java, or you have a Spring Boot application, or you have, let's say, a Swift iOS application, or you have a Node.js backend server, or you have like a JavaScript frontend, right? No matter what you have, and actually someone actually brought it up just some time back, was even if you have something like a WordPress site, right? You can instrument your applications using OpenTelemetry, and OpenTelemetry actually offers you libraries that allow you to instrument your application in just a few lines of code, and we'll actually take a look at that in a bit. And the second part of how do we fix this is to use tools that actually follow these standards. So some of these tools that I've listed below, we have Loki, we have Prometheus, we have Victoria Metrics, Jaeger, Fluentd, Pyroscope, Cilium. Now, for people who know these tools, they probably know that these tools all don't do the same thing. They actually focus on very different parts of the same problem. Pyroscope focuses on profiling, Jaeger does tracing, Victoria Metrics and Prometheus are looking at metrics and so on and so forth, as the name suggests. But they still talk the same language, right? The same language of OpenTelemetry. And that allows us or enables us to have tools that can communicate with each other, and you can pass context between them as well. So let's see what that actually looks like in practice, right? And this is where a small bit of a plug comes in. So before we get into that, let's take a look at what an observability stack would look like, right? As I mentioned, on the left side, you have all your applications, whether it's Spring Boot, Node.js, a Go microservice. It may be a single SSR app with hydration, maybe a Swift app, a React app, it doesn't really matter. Thanks to OpenTelemetry and others in the space, and recently we actually have an integration with Odigos as well. What this allows us to do is to instrument these applications to send out all their logs, metrics, and traces to an OpenTelemetry connector. And the collector in turn is able to push that data out to different sources. Now, depending on whether you have logs, you have metrics, you have traces, it can actually send it out to, say, Loki, Victoria Metrics. There's today even support for a lot of vendors have support for OpenTelemetry collector, simply because that's become quite become the standard across the ops space. So that's how, by and large, what an observability stack would look like. So this is the observability stack that we at OpsVerse use internally, right? And this is also part of what we call Observe Now, the product Observe Now. It follows the exact same stack. So the integrations we have is we support OpenTelemetry, obviously. On the front-end side of things, for JavaScript-based applications, we have two integrations. One is called OpsVerse RUM, and one is Grafana Faro. OpsVerse RUM is OpsVerse Real User Monitoring. And it's a wrapper that we built on top of OpenTelemetry JavaScript libraries that allow people to get up and running and instrument their applications in just a few lines of code, right? OpenTelemetry itself needs very few lines of code, but we have reduced that even further and made things a little bit more specific to the OpsVerse Observe Now use case. On the collector side of things, we have OpsVerse Agent. Now, OpsVerse Agent is a combination of different things. It's Grafana Agent, OTel Collector, Promptail, and eBPF Agent. And depending on different people and their use cases, we can turn on and off different components within the agent, right? For logs, we use distributed Loki. That basically means Loki with that's distributed across, that's run as a distributed system. For metrics, we use Victoria Metrics. And for traces, we use Jaeger. But rather than use Cassandra as the backend, we actually use ClickHouse. And Arul actually did a webinar or a talk sometime back about why we chose ClickHouse. And that's a great talk in itself. So you should check that out when you get the time. For analysis, we depend on Grafana quite a bit as our single source of truth, right? For all the data that comes in. And the reason we choose Grafana is, again, because it integrates very nicely with our entire stack, right? Whether it's Loki, whether it's Victoria Metrics, whether it's traces, you can all view it within the same UI. So we'll get into a quick demo now. Yeah. And this is the app that I'll be showing for the demo. It's quite a simple app, and I've instrumented it with both RUM and Grafana Faro. So for OpenTelemetry, right, anytime you have, like I mentioned, it works cross-language, and that means that you have, whether you have C++, .NET, Erlang, Elixir, whatever languages you have, most of them have very simple instrumentation options that may include, for Node, for example, it's just an npm install followed by adding 3 lines of code into the start of your file. For if you have a Flask application or a Python application, again, it's just a few lines of code. Same way, when we talk about web application instrumentation, this is for Grafana Faro that we have. It's literally just an npm install followed by 5 lines of code, right? And that's exactly what I've done in this application that I'll be demoing. It's more or less a vanilla instrumented application. And we'll talk a little bit more about, as you get into more advanced kind of use cases, what are the kind of advanced use cases you can tackle. Same way for RUM, we have, it's just a few lines of code, npm install followed by a few lines of code, and up and running with OpsVerse RUM. So let's get into the demo, right? So this is our demo app that I have. And as you can see, like, it has a few buttons here and there, which says generate a sample log, to generate a trace, to generate data processing, and to generate errors. And I can actually show my console. So if you see, when we generate a log, we have like, there's a console log, a console info, and some error log as well. When we generate a trace, it actually generates a trace in the backend. For data processing, it's calling some API and doing some processing, and then says it did some action. And if you have an error, then again, it just generates an error for you. I think something happened here, right? So now let's see how exactly we bring all of this together in an observability world that's built for the front end, right? That allows us to integrate the front end with the backend. And for this, we have our Opsource admin console. So I'll just go into the Observe Now stack that I have. We'll use Venus right now. I think we have it set up already. So this is something that you get out of the box, right? Like, once you have instrumented your application for front-end monitoring, things like your web vitals, your TTFB, your FCP, your CLS, things that matter if you're looking on the front end for, especially if you're very concerned about your Lighthouse scores, come in day one for you. Your P75s are tracked automatically. Your exceptions get tracked automatically. So for example, you can see exactly what are the exceptions that happened and how often they happened. So we have some failed to fetches, some network errors, which probably happened when the app was offline or someone went offline. And you can also track the exceptions over time, right? So you know how many people are seeing exceptions that you have. And note that all of this is actually being generated from your front end. It's not really a server that's generating the metrics for you. So you know which URLs are actually generating errors for you. You have the browsers that give you exceptions. You can create things like know what are the popular browsers for people visiting. You can track your sites, site visits that are happening. And the nice thing is you can also define custom events, right? So here, like I mentioned, this is one of the more advanced features which we have not really explored in this demo right now. But you can actually have specific events that you create that track different workflows within your system. So let's get into something again, because we are in Grafana and all this data is coming into Grafana from both the front end and the backend. So you can see things like your node heap usage, right? This on the backend, you have your node heap usage, and in the same UI, you can actually also see things like your front end logs, right? So you see some of these things, some error happened here. You get those logs along with all the instrumentation that you need for it, right? Or all the debugging instrumentation that you need. So your events, your logs, your metrics, your traces, everything comes into one single front end. And like I said, these are your metrics that come in, your traces that come in. So here, when I clicked on something, you can actually see that when I clicked on something, it generated this trace for me, which allows me to see that user action of click, what took time within it, right? And it looks like here, there was an HTTP get, and that has taken the most amount of time. And there's also, it looks like there are multiple HTTP gets happening within that click. So what this allows me to do is have like much more in-depth access to this data, right? And the same way, it's the same UI, but with the same UI, I can actually see the traces that happen for my backend application as well. And with a few more lines of code, like I said, this has just been instrumented with a standalone kind of version of this, but with a few more lines of code, we can actually merge the front end and backend traces as well using a process called trace propagation. In which case, what you can do is you can look at a front end app trace, which starts off at the front end, goes to the back end, makes a bunch of calls to all your microservices, comes back to the front end, does some more processing on it, and then returns a response. So this kind of workflow is something that we think is very, very powerful because it allows you to leverage the power of something like OpenTelemetry and create a stack that gives everyone a single source of truth. There's no more silos. There's no more support person saying X, the front end person seeing Y, and the backend person seeing Z. But instead, you have like one source of truth that the entire org shares, right? Now, because it's all in Grafana, it's all in Loki, you can generate metrics on top of it. You can generate alerts on top of it, depending on your logs, depending on whatever you want. You can do a whole bunch of cool stuff simply based on the fact that we've been able to leverage this open source tool or this open source library or this open source standard, depending on how you want to look at it, to generate this observability backend, right? And we honestly believe that that's kind of where the power of observability is, to actually be able to answer some of these questions of how did my system end up here. So with that, yeah, I think that covers the demo side of things. But of course, like we didn't want to end up saying that everything is good and will always be good. We're very, very huge fans of observability and of things like OpenTelemetry. But we, at the same time, also recognize the challenges that come with it, right? And the first primary challenge, I think, is purely in terms of standard rot over time. So the reason that we bring this up is because OpenTelemetry itself became very, very visible when people started moving more and more into a microservices kind of world, right? Where you didn't have one monolith, but you had multiple microservices. So you needed a standard way to have different microservices track data. But now what happens when we move to a different paradigm? Maybe we move into something that contains way more ML ops or something that has AI ops, or we start using hybrid apps, which are things like an Android app that makes massive use of web views, right? Then it's possible that this paradigm itself rots and the standard itself rots. And it's only a matter of time before someone comes in and says, hey, the OpenTelemetry standard doesn't meet my specific use case, so I'm going to create a new standard, right? So it's very, very important for different industry vendors and different industry people and different developers and ops folks to get together and like make sure that this this open telemetry remains as relevant as it is today. And another important challenge for us today is, today we see, like I mentioned in one of the slides before, a lot of vendors actually support open telemetry. But we have actually noticed quite a bit more and more that while they do accept data in an open telemetry standard, they very quickly store it or only give it out in a standard that is very proprietary to them, right? And I don't need to name these companies. I think most of us have used at least one or two of these tools in our careers, but it becomes very important to tell or to make it a point to have proprietary oligopoly companies that are there always have keep their standards open, right? If they're following an open standard, then they also have to talk back in their same open standard. It cannot be a one-way street. So that, I think, is like a couple of challenges that we have. But overall, I think at OpsVerse over the last few years, we've been very, very happy with the way that this observability stack has evolved for us to over like using a bunch of these observability tools, and the fact that something like OpenTelemetry exists has made it very, very easy for us to build out an observability stack, right? And when we started talking about front-end monitoring, again, because it's the same language that both the backend and the front-end now speak, it kind of made integrating front-end monitoring into the same stack very easy for us. And we honestly believe that that's something that a lot of companies are missing out on. And this is coming from personal experience across multiple different companies where that siloed nature of information has always existed. So we're hoping that with this talk, it encourages people to check out a little bit more about OpenTelemetry, look up Faro, look up tools that actually follow the OpenTelemetry standard. And yeah, in case you have any more questions, we are happy to answer them for you. And in case you want to play around with an observability stack based on that builds up on a bunch of open source and uses OpenTelemetry as its base, then yeah, we're more than happy to have you walk through Observe Now as well. With that, I end up. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Naveen. That was a great demo. So we do have a few minutes now for Q&A. So if you have any questions, you can actually type into the Q&A option in Zoom, and we'll actually we'll have Naveen go over those questions. So we'll wait and see if there are any questions. So there's a question on how different is RUM, real user monitoring, from sort of the current monitoring.
Yeah, so I think it's exactly the same a little bit the way I see it, right? As a developer, I see it as it's the same question being answered in different marketing terms, right? It's like different facets of the same question. The same way that how do you differentiate between a monitoring tool and a APM, right, so to speak. And I think the more and more the boundaries are a little more vague. But with real user monitoring, what we are trying to do is look at things more from a user's perspective rather than from a broader kind of system perspective, right? And with monitoring, we are trying to answer more questions along a higher system level this. And when we talk about something like what we just showed with Grafana, right, it allows us, or with observability, we're trying to answer questions that allow grouping of aggregates, right? So aggregate behavior. So the grouping of aggregation of behavior basically means that if you have 3% of your users complaining, right, of a certain problem on their front end, how do you identify what is common between all of them? If you don't know, right, if you don't know the metrics, you see that, yeah, for 3% of them are complaining about it. Maybe it's the geography they are coming from. Maybe all of their requests are going to one specific microservice. Maybe all of them use a specific version of a browser. Maybe all of them use a specific browser itself, right? With observability, what we're trying to do is find that middle ground between just saying real user monitoring at a per user level, what a user is doing, to where you get to monitoring where you're saying, is the system running or not? Because a system that's running 99% of times is great, but for that 1% of people, it absolutely sucks, right? And you want to avoid that as much as possible.
So we have one more question here. I'll just read it out for you. Thanks, Naveen, for the session. We are a heavy user of Observe Now and want to try this feature. Does this require us to upgrade our subscription? There's a question from an existing customer.
Yeah. Arul, you want to take that?
Yeah, so you don't have to upgrade your subscription. The front-end monitoring components are part of Observe Now as well. All you have to do is, it's just that you're going to collect more telemetry. You just use our integrations listed in the doc page and just instrument your apps to send these additional telemetry signals, and everything then comes together in Grafana. Where you'll be able to access these metrics and logs and the tracing telemetry in one place in Grafana. So you don't need to upgrade. It's part of the Observe Now package.
Yeah, and just to add on top of that, like I mentioned even during the talk, it's literally 6 lines of code, right? The lines are, it's there in our doc site. So it's an npm install followed by 6 lines of code, and you should be up and running and get almost everything that we have set up today.
All right. We're at the top of the hour. Do we have any other questions? Okay, there is one more question. We'll take this. So getting our engineering team's bandwidth is a challenge. How easy is it to instrument for front-end monitoring?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. And the reason I'm laughing is because I was the engineering team that was challenged for bandwidth for a long time. But yeah, on the front-end side of things, so the nice thing about OpenTelemetry is that almost every integration that we have, right, for whether we're talking front-end monitoring or we're talking something else, it is very much built by community for community. So it is very developer friendly. Like for example, for Java, I think it's just adding a Java agent and passing 3 environment variables. For Python, it's just a pip install followed by like 4 lines of code. And same way for front-end monitoring right here, it's literally just an npm install followed by 5 lines of code, and you just plug it in and everything works. And literally the name that you give here is the name that shows up in Grafana, right? So you don't really need too many hands to like do this, and you don't really need too much bandwidth to do this. The nice thing is also that the Faro SDK that we're talking about also comes in 2 parts, right? So you have a tracing SDK and you have a web SDK. So in case you just want to like start off light with just the web SDK, you can just use that. Again, it's just 5 lines of code. I think the difference is just saying tracing SDK here. So that's pretty.
We have one more question. Sorry to interrupt. Maybe we'll take that as well. So this question is: does the product have inbuilt AI that would list like top 5 potential issues? In case of outages, would it identify RCA? Maybe I can check that question. So right now, from an AI capabilities, what we have is we have basic anomaly detection capabilities, and the anomaly detection model can be applied on any metrics that come into the system. With respect to identifying RCA, this is something we are actually looking at bringing in integrations with other systems that specialized in RCAs and detecting RCAs. So that's the approach we are taking with respect to integrations. We will integrate with other solutions like Zebrium or Azerts.ai, which are specialized tools to look at RCA. All right. Yeah. So I mean, we can like maybe another 10 seconds to see if there are any other questions. All right. All right. I think this is a great webinar. Thanks a lot, Naveen, for like putting together a great demo. And thanks everyone for joining us today. That's the end of the webinar. Have a good day or good night, depending on where you are in the world today. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.